our numbers still continue to climb. I think that it's past the hour and I know everybody's time is valuable. So I think I will start us off with some introductions. Hello and thank you again. Welcome to today's inaugural event in a series we are calling Encountering Expertise in Intersectional Health. My name is Nat Hurley. I'm the Associate Director for Intersections of Gender Signature Area, as well as an Associate Professor in the Department of English and Film Studies and the Director of Media and Technology Studies here at the University of Alberta. Before I introduce the series, as well as today's event and our expert speakers formally, I want to recognize the conditions of possibility for our work here at the University of Alberta, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the lands of the Métis Nation Region 4. We work and live on the traditional lands of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other Indigenous peoples. Like all of our institutions, the U of A continues to be shaped by the forces of colonialism to the benefit primarily of white settlers. In this context, I consider myself to be an implicated subject who recognizes that the work of being in good relation to Indigenous colleagues, communities, staff members, and students is very much ongoing. So this series that we're inaugurating today, the Encountering Expertise in Intersectional Health Series, is jointly organized by UAlberta's Women's and Children's Health Research Institute, WICRI, and the Intersections of Gender Signature Area. So this is the first of 4 sessions in which panelists from the health sciences, the social sciences, and humanities come together to provide introductory, theoretical, and methodological, as well as applied and grant-oriented information about how health research and researchers can can, and should use an intersectional lens for more dynamic, informative, and impactful research. So our series today, titled, or today's event, the panel today, Addressing Inequities in Women's and Children's Health, sets to provide an overview under the basis that health and social inequalities exist across the globe, including in Canada. And the COVID-19 pandemic has just highlighted the need to consider the impact of intersectional social locations on health and social outcomes. So for example, racialized women are multiply impacted by the pandemic due to intersectional influences of gender and race. And so intersectionality considers how multiple intersecting locations, including race, gender, and income, can intersect to contribute to experiences and outcomes. In this sense, we might say the pandemic is not exclusively or even narrowly medical. It is medical, and it has larger effects that have long preceded the pandemic. So the presentation will begin today with basic information about intersectionality, including the history of intersectional theoretical perspectives. We'll discuss how intersectionality has been used in health and social research and practice as it relates to women and children. So since we've had such a big demand for this event today, I think it's a good indication of just the extent and the thirst for knowledge and information sharing. So this webinar will also be recorded, so many of our registrants will be able to access it later if they can't come in person today. The second panel in the series, we've currently scheduled or tentatively scheduled for April 27th to 28th, and that will be on methodological insight into incorporating intersectionality in qualitative and quantitative research design. So in that session, we'll be looking at how intersectionality theory has been used by health service researchers to bring to light how intersecting systems of oppression contribute to health experience. We will discuss key considerations in incorporating intersectionality in qualitative and quantitative research design. And so this may be helpful to some of you who'll be working on grant proposals. The recordings, by the way, I see in the chat somebody is asking, will be accessible through the Intersections of Gender website and as well through WICRI, I believe. And if Rachel is here in the audience, perhaps she can type into the Q&A here or into the chat how the recording will be available later. We'll certainly let you know before the time is up. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers today, an illustrious group that they are. Dr. Susanna Luman, who will kick us off, is an associate professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Alberta. From 2018 to 2020, she was the inaugural director of the Signature Area. And this works out of the Office of the Vice President, Research and Innovation. She has teaching research related to the institutionalization of intersectional gender studies and research, feminist and queer pedagogies, trauma and cultural memory, and sexuality studies. Her research has been published in the UK, Germany, Turkey, the US, and Canada in a wide range of journals. And she has recently co-edited a book with Amber Dean and Jennifer Johnson on Feminist Praxis Revisited, Critical Reflections on University Community Engagement. She is also the co-author of Troubling Women's Studies, Past, Presence, and Possibilities. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Denise Spitzer. A critical feminist medical anthropologist, Denise Spitzer is a professor in the School of Public Health here at the University of Alberta and an adjunct professor in the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa, where from 2005 to 2015, she was the Canada Research Chair in Gender, Migration, and Health, as well as a principal scientist in the Institute of Population Health. In addition to undergraduate studies in biology, Chinese language, and music, she holds a master's degree and doctorate in anthropology from the University of Alberta, so a true interdisciplinarian. Engaging in participatory research with migrant communities around the world, Dr. Spitzer is interested in examining how global processes mediated through intersectionality are implicated in health and well-being and experienced and expressed at the level of the body. Her current program of research focuses on the impacts of the global economy and multiple levels of policymaking on immigrants, migrants, and refugees in different parts of the globe, most notably Southeast and East Asia, Canada, and the Horn of Africa. She also engages with critical perspectives of the body, transnationalism, and constructions of identity. She is the recipient of no fewer than 31 research grants as principal investigator and 38 more as co-investigator. And she has a lot of experience facilitating numerous multinational and multilingual participatory research projects. Dr. Bukola Salami is an associate professor. She will round out our panel as the third speaker. She's an associate professor at the Faculty of Nursing here at the U of A and the current director. I'm pleased to work with her as part of the Intersections of Gender signature area. Her research program focuses on policies and practices shaping migrants' health, and she's been involved in about 80 funded research projects, being the lead on about 30 of these. So we have some real research heavyweights here on this panel. About 30 of these are funding from national and international agencies. She has led research projects on vaccine confidence among Black Canadians, COVID-19 disinformation among Black Canadians, African immigrant child health, immigrant mental health, access to healthcare for immigrant children, Black youth mental health, international nurse migration, immigrant child mental health, the experiences of live-in caregivers and care recipients, and the experiences of temporary foreign workers, internally displaced people, and the parenting practices of African migrants. So quite a resume here. She has around 80 published scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals, 2 book chapters, and 8 reports. She's also the associate editor for the Canadian Medical Association Journal and a member of the advisory board of the Canadian Institutes for Health Research for Human Development, Child and Youth Health. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen to enable Dr. Luman to share her screen and get her to kick things off for us. Thank you again to everybody for coming today, and I very much look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Nat, for that generous introduction. I'm just going to do the technological work of trying to share my screen, and then we are off. So good afternoon. I'm speaking with you today from Amiskwesik, also known as Edmonton, Alberta in Canada. I'm a white settler immigrant living and working on Treaty 6 territory and the homelands of the Métis Nation Region 4. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me today to offer some very basic introductory comments on intersectionality, the concept and its history, before other panelists then will speak more directly about intersectional research design. And I want to begin with a little bit of an anecdote. In 2018, the important research of one of our colleagues here at the University of Alberta hit the news quite big. Margie Davenport, who is a cardiovascular health researcher in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation, had shown in her research that women who are pregnant and exercise during their pregnancy can cut the odds of developing a major complication by at least a quarter. And so the new recommendation was 150 minutes of light to medium exercise, that would actually benefit pregnant women. And this is a wonderful research success story that of course hit the news quite big nationally and locally. And I just happened to drive in my car when the CBC did a bit of a call-in show about this important research finding. And I was kind of struck when one of the callers identified herself as an Indigenous young woman and mother with a disabled child who was also pregnant again, and who commented on the news that for her, these recommendations were actually quite unachievable because she had neither means for a gym membership, nor ways to get to the gym, nor sufficient childcare for her disabled child. And she actually called out to us researchers to be more intersectional and to address the situation of her and others like her. And so, as we were at that moment still developing intersections of gender as a signature research area, I was, of course, kind of shoved because we had such a hard time to convince the senior leadership that intersectionality actually matters, or that it was even a term under which research and knowledge production was happening. So I was really excited that a member of the public actually spoke to intersectional research. And clearly understood the concept, whilst our senior leadership had some difficulties with wrapping their heads around it. And of course, then I also began to wonder what research on exercise during pregnancy would actually look like if it were grounded in an intersectional methodology. So what would the outcomes and recommendations be if they were actually grounded in the experience and living conditions of women like the caller? So here we're talking about Indigenous women or women of color with limited financial means, insufficient childcare, transportation issues. So in short, what would our research look like if it was actually grounded in the life of marginalized women, rather than what most research on women's health probably still looks like, namely grounded in data taken from or gathered with white, often middle class, non-disabled, heterosexual, cisgender women, who then tend to become emblematic of all women. So in a nutshell, I would say this is precisely what intersectionality has been asking of us researchers for a couple of decades now, namely to conceive of our research as grounded in the specificities of women or people more broadly who face compounding forms of inequality. And so when we go back to the history of the term intersectionality, we reach back to 1977, but also much further. But in 1977, the Combahee River Collective, a Black queer women activist group in the US, who were at the time both involved in feminist and Black activism, kind of articulated the realization that the feminist activism they were involved in tended to address the issues of white heterosexual women, whilst the Black Power movement they were working with largely addressed the struggles of Black men. So the Combahee River Collective in 1977 then decided to dedicate themselves to addressing what they described as the interlocking forms of oppression. And a couple of decades later, in 1989, the African-American legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, and many of you probably know this already, coined the term intersectionality, and she was working on a case study of employment discrimination. So this was a case that was brought forward on behalf of a group of African-American women who had challenged the company that they're working for on the basis of being discriminated. But what happened, as Crenshaw shows in her case study, is that the judge actually dismissed the case because the judge was arguing that the company was actually promoting Black men and the company was promoting white women. So the judge decided that there could be no discrimination on the basis of race or gender. And what Crenshaw shows in this article, in this discussion of this case, is that the judge failed to recognize the very specific employment discrimination of African-American women, which could not be reduced to sexism or racism alone, but that was actually grounded in the very specific ways in which racism and sexism interconnected and excluded African-American women from career achievement in that company. In another text from the early 1990s, Crenshaw shows how a women's shelter fails an immigrant woman who is seeking to escape a violent relationship and needs immediate shelter from further violence because of the requirement of that shelter that all women who they admit need to speak English in order to be able to participate in the shelter's support groups for women. So failing to see how the intersections of language barrier, immigration status, and gender shapes the specific needs of this and other women, Crenshaw argued, points to the kind of failure or the absence of an intersectional analysis. She also pointed to the legal situation in which the woman's right to be in the US was actually linked to her husband's sponsorship and the risk of deportation in the case of marriage breakdown. So this is the context in which Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 terms this intersectionality. Crenshaw, of course, is not terms this term, but she really builds on a century of Black feminist thought before her. And so what Crenshaw showed us through this concept of intersectionality is that Black women's oppression can neither be reduced to or understood through only a gendered lens, nor through the lens of race. And Crenshaw termed intersectionality to point to the ways that racism and sexism work together and intersect to structure Black women's opportunities and experiences. And in 2020, she kind of talks about intersectionality as a lens or a prism, and is a way of seeing in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exasperate each other. She says, we tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. And what's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of the parts. In my own field, in women and gender studies, we probably are the kind of discipline that has most vigorously embraced the concept of intersectionality, if not necessarily as a reality of all our work, but as a commitment or an aspiration for improving our teaching and knowledge production. And we have been doing so probably for at least 2 decades. And so with intersections of gender as a signature area at the University of Alberta, the goal is to mainstream intersectionality from feminist and women and gender studies to all disciplines. And of course, people in other disciplines are working on this already, but it's really a kind of mainstreaming it across all disciplines. And so this aspiration is grounded in the understanding that research that does not attend to the ways that experiences and life chances are structured by the complexly intersecting forms of inequality and privilege risk reproducing existing forms of inequality. And so research that is not intersectionally and does not support the goal or does not work with an intersectionality, we could argue, actually is not research that supports the public good, which is one of the principles of one of the commitments of the University of Alberta. And I would actually argue that non-intersectional research risks failing as it risks continuing and normalizing harm. So, of course, the project of mainstreaming intersectionality, which is Intersections of Gender's project, also has pitfalls or risks. And there's quite a bit of, I would say, critique of a project of mainstreaming intersectionality. And I think this has to be taken quite seriously. I think quite a few Black scholars worry, and rightly so, that any mainstreaming of intersectionality will actually erase Black feminist intellectual histories and politics, and might actually lead to further evading of attention to the specific conditions of life and death of Black women. Or another concern is that mainstreaming intersectionality might actually appropriate the intellectual contributions of Black feminist scholars. Or another concern is that when what we call intersectional research in a kind of mainstream context, that this is really just diversity management and kind of diversifying identities of researchers or subjects. And therefore, that we risk losing track of the structural and critical analysis of oppression and privilege that intersectionality foregrounds. And I can't really argue with these concerns. I think they are very real and need to be addressed. And I think this is certainly part of our work. I think in my own thinking about mainstreaming intersectionality as a research lens or research central to research design, I think of intersectionality as something that is a compromise and that is potentially also compromised. I think mainstreaming intersectionality is driven by a desire for a political and scholarly desire for better and more socially just research. I think it's an aspiration for research to do less harm that is grounded in what Jennifer Nash has called, and quote, an ethics of improvement. And I would say that mainstreaming intersectionality needs to be understood, in its kind of flawed as a compromise, and also addressing the risk of it being a compromised formation. I would say what I value deeply about intersectionality is its call to recognizing and reckoning with dominant forms of research and what I would argue most disciplines continue to produce today. A commitment to intersectionality calls on us to decenter whiteness, heteronormativity, androcentricity, ableism, and many other forms of structural inequality, but all of which continues to dominate most disciplines' research paradigms, and therefore risk or contributes to the maintaining of white supremacy, as well as the colonial project of the university. I think we also need to acknowledge that the methodology or the methodological orientation towards intersectionality is more aspiration at this time than reality. It's incredibly complex and difficult to produce. I also think it's important to think about the challenges that we're facing in our commitment or an aspiration towards more intersectionality in our research design. And I would say one of the real challenges is that many researchers encounter the problem of a lack of disaggregated data. For example, in the context of the current COVID-19 crisis, we know on the one hand that the health and social impact of this pandemic is worse for Indigenous, Black, people of color, women, and people with disabilities, LGBTQ2S communities, and poor people. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive categories. On the other hand, my understanding is that, at least in Canada in 2020, I don't know if that has changed, the provinces and federal governments only collect gender data. That means to actually have data from which to do an intersectional analysis is not, that the data is not easily available. So I think the lack of disaggregated data that is available to researchers is a major problem for an intersectional research design. I also think we need to acknowledge that we still train too few scholars and junior researchers in intersectional methodologies. We also face, of course, the crisis of that our research teams and our faculty contingents is not as diverse and does not reflect the demographics of Canada, for example. But I think another issue is that funding frameworks often make intersectional research either more difficult or don't demand or intersectional research design as a marker of quality and excellence. They might actually privilege non-intersectional research. And so I think some of the issues that we're facing in this kind of mainstreaming of intersectional research is that we have not yet made intersectional approaches the standard of excellence in publication review and in other forms of research dissemination. So I think what we're facing right now is that we are still grappling with how to produce and how to set up intersectionality as a mainstream and expected standard of research, not just in kind of feminist or anti-racist context. And I think what this really leaves us with is a kind of urgency to develop intersectional expertise and expectations when we kind of recognize and kind of take seriously that without an intersectional research design, we actually cannot fully understand the role of racism, colonialism, sexism, and other structures of inequality as social determinants of the economic, social, and physical well-being and health of some, or the condition of illness and death for others. So I think this is something that we are still kind of grappling with 30 years into the development of intersectionality as a lens, and in the aftermath of over 100 years of Black scholars kind of working or building towards intersectionality. I will leave it at this and turn the microphone over to my colleague, Denise Spitzer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. And with that, we have the table set for a very urgent conversation about the kind of research and contributions that our speakers are making and that everybody is working with in the fields of health studies and inequalities. So Denise, over to you if you'd like to share your screen.
I will indeed, but I have to share that we're doing an interspecies conversation today. So my cat usually does not like to come and sit with me, but obviously she's very interested in today's topic. So please bear with me while I get set up here for a moment. Yes, she is adorable. Come on. Yeah.
No question, no question.
No question
Kitties for the
that.
win.
There we go. Hopefully, sorry. No, not that. I had it all set up here before, but talk amongst yourselves while I mess about. You
Technology is friend and foe.
Can you see that now? All good?
All good, all good.
Excellent. Well, first off, I'd like to really thank Intersections of Gender and WICRI for this invitation. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from unceded Algonquin territory and actually right now occupied territory of Ottawa. I am a migrant settler and I am very aware of the honor and privilege I have of residing on this land. And I commit myself, I hope, every day to draw from my own cultural tradition of Tikkun Olam, which is to, with others, heal the world. So I thank Suzanne very much for that introduction to intersectionality. Intersectionality is, of course, an evolving concept, but it is, as she has said, rightly rooted in Black queer feminist thought. It is, as can be expected, a concept that is differently imagined sometimes and deployed across different disciplines. So what I'd like to do is just give you a very brief overview of how I define it and use it in my own research, and then talk a bit about the work I do with migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong and highlight how intersectional status is integral to their health and well-being, and particularly under the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as a concept has developed, intersectionality is often more regarded as a shifting constellation of mutually constituted markers of social differentiation. So people talk about gender, ethnicity, racialized, socioeconomic, migrant, and sexual minority status, indigeneity, disability, age, and geography, which taken together expose individuals and groups of individuals to the deprecations of oppressions and, in some iterations, to considering privileges as well. So the number and the range of social indicators that must be considered in intersectional analysis when you're sitting down and doing a research project is really debatable and often dependent upon the context and the problem under investigation. However, most commonly people attend at least to gender, ethnicity, and racial status and socioeconomic class. Importantly, intersectionality, at least from the way I like to envision it, is really differentiated from static additive approaches to understanding these concepts. So we used to have sort of gender plus class, gender plus class plus racialized status, but often that failed to really examine how those different categories are co-constituted. So furthermore, I think we can't always assume that there's a single element of identity that assumes some primacy in an issue. So often, again, there's this, when you go with a concept of gender plus XYZ, it presumes the importance or the greatest salience is put on gender. And in fact, I would argue that it's again, the mutual constitution of all of these things acting in concert with one another that is important, but that we have to also be open to the fact that in some situations that research I've done, and indigeneity is just the most important thing in a particular context. So I think it allows us to understand not only the way things work together, but the ways in which certain axes of differentiation can be more potent in certain considerations. For me, the work of intersectionality, it really allows us to examine how social beings are situated in and presented to the world as whole entities, again, not as these fragments, but as whole entities. And it helps us uncover how individuals and groups of individuals are positioned in social hierarchies. So as the sinew connecting identity, social structure, and the materiality of social location, intersectional status structures access to social and material resources and power. Consequently, intersectionality has implications for health and well-being and social relations, and as Suzanne has mentioned, helps to illuminate health disparities and other forms of inequalities. Importantly, intersectionality is also slippery. Where and how people are situated in the social landscape can be fluid and ever-shifting. We see this a lot in migration research. It also, because it is interactive and kinetic, it's also very difficult to depict visually and sometimes textually. So, but I would argue, in fact, that intersectionality better reflects the messiness of lived human experience, which also means that whatever we do, our insights are always partial and always very complex. So, but the uncovering and the undermining of power relations, the promotion of struggle for social justice, as Dr. Lewin pointed out, really lies at the core of intersectional analysis. So focusing on the way in which intersectionality positions individuals and groups of individuals in the social world helps us retain focus on power relations that underpin the structure of social landscapes. Furthermore, shifting attention to the construction of axes of social differentiation under patriarchal capitalism and deploying critical anti-racist and post-colonial thought reinforces and reminds us constantly of the political and activist orientation that intersectionality brings. So how does intersectionality help with research with migrant domestic workers? To set the context, human beings have been migrating around the world for millennia. But contemporary neoliberal globalization has really intensified migration. We have to remind ourselves, though, that movement of peoples is not a uniform phenomenon. There are presently around 272 million migrants. Among them, 169 million are migrant workers, temporary foreign workers, and that is people who are not bound for permanent resettlement in another country. A reminder that national borders are semi-porous membranes, and country of origin, education, and socioeconomic status really figure prominently in determining who, in fact, is allowed to remain in a destination country. Moreover, gender figures prominently in the type of work temporary foreign workers undertake. And I pause here for a moment to the caveat, like why I am very aware of the fluidity of sex and gender categories. The official statistics I quote here are collected as dichotomous categories. So we are kind of left with them. So of the 169 million migrant workers in this world, 70 million are women, 39.4 million of them are engaged in the service sector. Many of these women are working in health and care work, tending to children, the elderly, the infirm, in institutional or private settings, as personal support workers, home care attendants, nursing aides or assistants. And of that 39.4 million, 11.5 million are migrant domestic workers. The intersection of gender, migration, class, nationality, racialized status, and work have obvious implications for the global labor market streams, which again kind of underscores that these social indicators cannot be considered as separate categories. These interacting factors and their attendant political processes come together to position women as temporary foreign workers in very particular physical and social places, locally, nationally, and transnationally, which create disparate intersectional vulnerabilities. Gender ideologies that construct care work as a labor of love to be undertaken by women, of course, devalues its economic and social worth and positions women migrant care workers in often low-waged and precarious positions, which have become even more a high risk during the period under conditions of the pandemic. So we know many of the populations who are doing care work in nursing homes and in home care and other hospital settings are often migrants. In 2019, approximately 400,000 migrant domestic workers, primarily from the Philippines and Indonesia, were employed in Hong Kong. Migrant domestic workers work an average of over 70 hours per week, for which they earn minimum wage. They are tied by their visa to a single employer for a 2-year renewable contract. They usually spend the first year paying back loans that were made by the recruitment agencies, so they earn very little, even less, I should say, during the first year. And they are required to reside with their employers, who are expected to provide so-called suitable accommodation and either free food or a food allowance. 60% of migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong have reported either sleeping in a bedroom with their care recipients, so it would be an elderly care recipient or children, or in a non-bedroom space. It could be a storage area, a kitchen, a place in the closet, on a sofa, sort of thing. Furthermore, they are entitled each week to a 24-hour rest period, but only a third say that fully a third say that they are unable to avail themselves of that legally mandated weekly rest period. Employers also, of course, because they live with them, exercise control over food portion and choice if they're not given a food allowance. These recruitment agencies that, again, broker contracts may offer warranties, excuse me, for the migrant domestic workers as though they were household objects. They will offer replacements within an introductory period, and employers may dismiss migrant domestic workers if they fail to meet their expectations. Contracts may be terminated by their employer with either 1 month's notice or pay in lieu of notification. And here you see on this slide, it was a May Day demonstration in Jakarta, so they were obviously saying no to the sign that says Indonesian maids now on sale, but you see those kinds of advertisements all the time. So living and working in the same place as one's employer can heighten interpersonal tensions, as it demands self-surveillance and control over emotions and behaviors. Moreover, the ubiquity of home-based video surveillance to patrol workers when employers are absent impacts the pace and the conduct of their work as they feel unable to take a break. The lack of privacy they encounter in the workplace is not always alleviated on their rest days. Migrant domestic workers are often subject to public surveillance when they gather on Sundays, which is presumably their only rest day. And so if you've ever been to Hong Kong, you'll often see large numbers of Indonesian domestic workers congregating in Victoria Park, as this slide indicates, or the Filipinos often will gather in Central District in Hong Kong and other places through Kowloon and Hong Kong Island, but these are sort of the major gathering places. And the tenuous conditions in which they live, work, and earn for their families is underscored, as I've noted, by the precariousness of their migration status. With minor exceptions, migrant domestic workers have 2 weeks after contract expiry or termination to leave Hong Kong unless they can secure another position. Furthermore, although other migrant workers are eligible for permanent residency status after residing in Hong Kong for 8 years, migrant domestic workers are excluded from this possibility. Overall, the working and living conditions have a deleterious effect on health and well-being, as self-reported health amongst migrant domestic workers is lower than for other Hong Kong residents. It worsens with inadequate accommodation, with larger household size, with challenges sending remittances, and with abuse. Importantly, these kinds of gatherings that they have on Sundays and where they have gained social support from their friends has been shown to mitigate at least some of these effects. The COVID-19 pandemic emerged in Hong Kong in January 2020, engendering a series of public health measures, including travel bans, restrictions on mobility and public gatherings, quarantine requirements, and closures of workplaces and schools. These actions led to the immobilization of migrant workers who could neither leave nor return to Hong Kong. You may recall that this happened around the Chinese New Year, and many people were already on holidays. And what this meant was that thousands of migrant workers were stranded in the Philippines, unable to resume employment in Hong Kong after their leaves. To accommodate migrant workers whose contracts had expired but were unable to leave Hong Kong, the government extended employee contracts and the period to search for employment from 2 weeks to 2 years. Early on in the pandemic, PPEs were in short supply and increasingly expensive. When the government dispersed PPEs to households, they were often not shared with migrant domestic workers who were integral members of those households. Also, adult Hong Kong residents were provided with 10,000 Hong Kong dollars to defray pandemic expenses, but migrant domestic workers were excluded from receiving this benefit. Those who live, of course, as migrant domestic workers in the same household as their employers reported, of course, increased workloads. They said that employers' expectations that they provide, again, their own PPEs, and many reported greater vulnerability to abuse. In June 2020, the Hong Kong government introduced a policy whereby migrant domestic workers were required to present a negative COVID test and to quarantine for 14 days, which was later extended to 21 days upon arrival, the expenses of which were to be covered by their employers, although they often relied on food delivery from migrant organizations. While others coming in from different destinations could choose which hotels they wish to quarantine in, migrant domestic workers were compelled to stay in 1 or 2 designated hostels, which were deemed quite overcrowded and unsanitary. And in fact, people were concerned that they would be actually contracting COVID-19 at these facilities rather than being safe from it. Restrictions on gathering of more than 4 people, and right now 2 people, and the closure of public recreation areas meant that migrant domestic workers who would normally, as I mentioned, gather on Sundays to socialize, rest, connect with resources and informational support, as noted on these slides, were displaced. And in those areas where my workers once met in large numbers, police have increased surveillance and issued fines if individuals are insufficiently separated or exceeded the numbers of allowable people. And some of you may have seen images of police sort of standing in these areas holding signs indicating how far apart they need to be and to only be in groups of 2 or 4, depending upon what was the regulation at the time. The police, of course, were this kind of, talked about this surveillance, and media reports of these interventions fed into the notion that migrant domestic workers were disease carriers and posed a threat to Hong Kong residents. This discourse was reinforced when the Labor Department urged migrant domestic workers to remain at home during the rest days and refrain from using public transport and spaces. And I note that they were making these suggestions while at the same time, the same people going to the market every day and taking their employers' children to school. And somehow it was acceptable for them to be out and about during the week, but not on the rest day. So some employers interpreted this message as a directive, and they in fact curtailed workers' mobility in the name of public health. So migrant domestic workers were required to often stay home on their rest day, and they were compelled when they were at work to work even longer hours, undertaking nearly constant cleaning with harsh chemicals, and some were ordered to bathe multiple times a day, which was not demanded of other household members. So all of that was happening while they were getting increasing demands from their family at home for pandemic-related expenses. So all of this kind of heightened fear of job loss and result many domestic workers who remained in abusive situations that they might have left in the past. The government also proposed mandatory vaccinations against COVID-19 but only for migrant domestic workers. That was a suggestion was withdrawn after migrant organizations who, again, promote vaccination, complained that this would further stigmatize migrant domestic workers. Increased demands, again, from employers, increased public opprobrium, loss of rest and support, fear of job loss, worrying about their families, all of these things heighten stress amongst migrant domestic workers and have contributed to ongoing high levels of depression. As Dolores Pelaez from UNIFIL, which is a Filipino migrant rights organization, told me, they look at domestic workers as virus carriers. So therefore, they should be programmed to have mandatory tests and mandatory vaccination. That's not mandatory for others. We are promoting vaccination, but to have it mandatory from the government is another thing. So they're also dealing with what I would call pandemic racism. In addition to migration status, the impact of pandemic responses reflects the intersection of gender and nationality. Care work and parenting work is often allocated to women, and many migrant domestic workers are engaged in transnational parenting, which has intensified during this period. Furthermore, employers often display a preference for workers from different nationalities, which actually has impacted, again, workers' mobility in the pandemic. Filipinos, quote unquote, are, and as a group, are often chosen to work with children. They're seen as more capable of teaching children English, whereas Indonesians are regarded as more suitable for working with the elderly, for whom English language skills may be less important. But what has happened is that under the guise of public health, Indonesian workers were disproportionately forbidden from leaving the house because they were thought that if they went out, that they would be bringing COVID back home to the elderly. So they were often, their mobility was constrained even more than the Filipino workers. Now, despite these challenges, migrant domestic workers, I want to add, are not wholly bereft. There are a lot of very powerful migrant worker organizations and advocacy groups, labor unions, as well as faith-based and civil society organizations that have been providing ongoing support to migrant domestic workers. And in my interviews with some of these representatives, they say that even though they are providing social support and are trying to provide mental health interventions, that they are very concerned about the long-term impacts that this is going to have on these workers. So very briefly, how does an intersectional analysis help nuance how we understand health and well-being of Filipino and Indonesian migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong? Let's begin at the level of the body and issues around stress. So first, in contrast to other immigrants and other migrant workers from the global north who can move to a place like Hong Kong and find stable work, precarity is embedded in the work and the lives of migrant domestic workers, as failure to please their employers for any reason can lead to termination, loss of migrant status, which of course has implications for not only themselves, but their families who may be reliant on their remittances. Lack of control over the pace and method of work, over the food type and portion. They are often under surveillance and such that they might not even be able to use a mobile phone to contact friends or to contact their families. And of course, the absence of the boundary between work and home leaves them very vulnerable to physical, sexual, financial, and psychological abuse. All of these things, of course, are major stressors. And I would say, in fact, that they are subject to unrelenting stress, which we know has deleterious health effects. Additionally, in the Indonesian workers in particular are subject to Islamophobia and other forms of pandemic racism. Again, access to social support, which is a major determinant of health, is also greatly limited. Familial responsibilities, including sending remittances and transnational parenting, are again particularly gendered, and even though people have talked about how these are very fulfilling roles, as you can imagine, they can also cause a lot of worry and stress for people. Now, as Dr. Lubin has mentioned, all of these kinds of stressors really predate the pandemic, but they have been greatly, greatly intensified under these conditions, particularly as mobility has been curbed and, as noted, even more so for Indonesian workers. So intersectionality asks us to return to the question, for me, how do axes of differentiation, how are they constructed and whose benefit do they serve in these issues? So for this reason, we need to focus our attention to the broader macro level to situate the health and well-being of Filipino and Indonesian workers who are channeled again into service and care work as part of a global, gendered, and racialized division of labor. Furthermore, we're compelled, I think, to consider a number of things, like how is this so-called care demand for care work constructed? What does this mean about the gendered and class structure of Hong Kong? What is the role of their own country's neoliberal agendas that make them, that encourage and in fact, the out-migration of certain workers? And most notably, what about the machinations of the global north, multilateral organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank, who profit altogether from women's labor and these women's lives? So in essence, the health and well-being of Filipino and Indonesian migrant domestic workers cannot be confined to clinical outcomes, but must be situated within the context of neoliberal globalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Bukola, the screen is yours if you'd like to share your screen.
Thank you for having me present. So I will focus my presentation on intersectionality and Black youth mental health. I will draw on findings from a study that we did in 2000 about mental health of Black youths. And I'm Bukola Salami, Associate Director of Intersections of Gender, Signatory and Associate Professor at the Faculty of Nursing. So here is my agenda. I will talk about social determinants of health, Canada's history of racism, intersectionality, and then Black youth mental health. So we may all be located in different territories. Probably most of us are located in Treaty 6 territory. I respectfully acknowledge that I'm located in Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous people, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota, Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, I can see this, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and culture continue to influence our vibrant community. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, newcomers in this generation or past generation, and I am very mindful of the broken covenants and strive to make this right with the land and also with each other. So why consider intersections of gender? So a lot of the things I'm going to be talking today are at the intersections of race. And it's important to consider intersections of race, especially in Canada, due to Canada's history of racist policy. So, around 1910, there was a Governor in Council proclamation that prohibited on for a stated period or permanently in Canada, landing of individuals, of immigrants belonging to a certain race who are deemed unsuited to the climate or requirement of Canada's, to the climate of Canada. So there was a time we specifically had a policy that said, if you're Black, so Negro race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirement of Canada. So there was a time we had, that someone could actually be denied based on the fact that you're non-white from coming to Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first statement in the introduction section, talks about the cultural genocide that Canada has perpetrated towards the Indigenous people, including residential school and also including slavery of Indigenous people and also of Black people in Canada. In 2007, there was a landmark report released by the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. So the Prime Minister of Canada had invited the United Nations to Canada to look at what is the situation of Black people in Canada. And the report concluded that Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization of African Canadians has left a legacy of anti-Black racism and now a deleterious impact on people of African descent, which must be addressed in partnership with the affected community. And the report identified the need for race-based data. So what is intersectionality? Dr. Susan Luman has already explained this. It's a theoretical perspective regarding the influence of diverse social locations on a particular phenomenon, such as health outcomes. As Dr. Luman discussed, it moves beyond first and second wave feminist perspective that oftentimes essentializes the experiences of women. It considers diverse social locations as fluid and independent. So in health research, intersectionality has been used to examine the health issues in Canada and globally. It can help to understand how diverse social locations contribute to health inequities. An intersectional perspective recognizes how power and power relations across intersecting social locations are reproduced and how these power relations can contribute to health. It can also contribute to our understanding of social determinants of health. And as we know, the diverse social determinants of health, including gender and race and racism, was, within the last 6-7 years, included on the Public Health Agency of Canada, social determinants of health. Social determinants of health cannot be reduced to one single determinant or marker of difference, right? Rather, diverse social determinants of health interact to contribute to population health and health outcomes in Canada. And we can see the case of that in the case of COVID-19 pandemic, that, when we look at, what are some of the influences that, populations or regions where there are more racialized people are more likely to have COVID-19. But we know that COVID-19 has also had more in-depth burden on women who, especially in the early days of the pandemic, took on more care work as the country adjusts to COVID-19 pandemic. Intersectionality can help illuminate how diverse social locations can interact to manifest in health inequities. For example, by examining the interconnections between social relationship, dominance, and oppression, deeper insights may be revealed about a person's mental health status. So some of the methodological tenets, and we go more into this in the future presentation, includes the need to attend to power, the focus or stride towards social justice, the need to address the oppression, relationality, the complexity in terms of analysis, and oftentimes people think intersectionality is limited to qualitative researchers. Intersectionality is also increasingly being used as a theoretical framework and a framework in quantitative research techniques by, for example, considering interacting effect of different variables and deconstruction. So in 2020, we completed a participatory action research on mental health of Black youths. And we sought to examine the mental health needs of Black youths, the barriers to access and use of mental health services of Black youths, culturally relevant and effective approaches to increasing access and uptake of Black youths, mental health, and potential influence to mobilize African, Black, and Caribbean youths to improve mental health outcomes or to build resilience. We used the participatory action research approach, and to begin, actually the interview questions were informed by the Black youths themselves. So at that time, I was a member of Africa Center Board, and I was told at that time that, that the youths had challenges in terms of resources to help sustain their program. So I went to the youths and I asked them, how can I be of help? I didn't actually have mental health in mind as what I wanted to focus on. And the youths actually mentioned that they wanted a participatory approach, and they specifically tell me, we don't want to just be, what word did they use? We don't want to just participate. No, we don't want to, I forgot the word that they used, that they wanted participatory. We don't want to just be involved. So that's what they said. We wanted participatory. And they also specifically told me we want intersectionality, which I was surprised but many of the youths were university students. And at that time, they've started learning about intersectionality, that we wanted a perspective that considers our intersectional social locations. And we started by setting up an advisory committee of youths. Some of the youths told me, well, we don't want to just sit on the bench, we want to engage, we want to get our hands wet. So they wanted to collect their data themselves. So I hired some of the youths, around 6 of them, to also be the ones to collect the data themselves. And the youths, they went through a training program of around 4 hours. They also completed Tri-Council policy statement on research ethics online. They went through a mock interview, and with guidance and mentorship, they collected their data themselves. And oftentimes when I do this presentation, they often do the presentation with me. They've presented 3 times this similar presentation as this. With me not involved, I just reviewed the PowerPoint and they go give their presentation. So it's been a really, really successful story. So we interviewed 30 Black youths. And after the interviews, we did 4 conversation cafes with 99 youths. And the conversation cafe were an open forum for stimulating dialogue on relevant societal issues. We combined small breakout sessions with larger breakout sessions featuring mental health speakers. And the last session that we had on the mental health of Black youths, 2 youths, so we had 4 sessions. One session was on mental health, introduction to mental health. It was September, so the youths wanted to just get everyone prepared in terms of taking care of their mental health before the school began. One session, the youths were interested in intergenerational relations. So they wanted us to have a speaker that talked about intergenerational relations. And then we had a breakout session where the youths actually discussed how to tackle that. And then there was another session where the youths had intersectionality perspective. And for that session, the youths really, really also wanted someone from the LGBTQ2+ community to also be present for that section. And we had another session, and the youth also, they had a smaller breakout session, and they had a bigger session where they discussed together several diverse issues related to intersectionality. And then the last session they had was policy practice implication session. And for that session, the youths took themselves through thinking and reimagining what an ideal mental health clinic will look like. Well, the result of that last session is that then the youths took the results of that and presented it to the executive director of Africa Center, who was able to use it to apply for funding to create the first Black mental health clinic in the province of Alberta. So here are the youths that participated in this study. We had some degree of, a lot of the youths that participated in this were either non-binary or female, and that was just based on the composition of the youth group that was that organized this. And many of them were university students, and actually one was a graduate, one was a practicing teacher. And this was the pictures here were on our final day of presentation to the committee, where the youths took the lead in terms of presenting the results to members of the community. And the person in the middle is the research assistant who was a PhD student here at the University of Alberta, who was in charge of coordinating the youths and supporting the youths. So some of the factors that we found influence mental health of youths include racism. So one of the youths talked about, I grew up with so much internalized anti-Black racism. God, I hated myself. I wanted to be white so bad. I wanted to have straight hair. I wanted to have lighter lips. I wanted smaller lips. There was one time, and then she talked about there was one time a girl told me I was sleeping over at her house, and she was looking at me. I was like, what? And she's like, you have nigger lips. So, she had a lot of experience. She also The same youth discussed how she was walking past the street one day and someone threw a Slurpee at her and called her the N-word. So she grew up really, really experiencing racism, and not just did it affect her at that point in time, she has continued to internalize that racism as even until her adult years. So some of the Black youths talked about the need in terms of how they attend to their issues related to masculinity. So one of the youths talked about, in the community it's very easy because obviously the community understands the struggle out there. And this was a Black male youth that was talking. Out of my community years, I think subconsciously learned to do this. It's kind of like I'm thinking of the word, just kind of start out with the notion that I'm not going to rob you, right? Or just kind of when I interact, especially just blatantly blank with white, especially when I interact with white people. Just kind of the first thing that I have to attack is the preconceived notion that I'm Black, I'm Tog, or whatever. So is experience of racism and perceptions related to masculinity influences his experiences, and also influences his mental health and how he has to conduct himself. And another youth talked about, because the toxic masculinity is not a Black thing, it's an everybody thing, it's a every male thing. What separates us is we have an added thing called racism, because now in terms of mental health, we're not talking as men, we are not taking care of ourselves mentally. And now there's this added factor of 8 from another group of males who more or less have the same struggle as you. So again, the intersections between racism and gender. Cultural perception, so the idea about strong Black women also influenced the youth's mental health. So some of it was the females that talked about the fact that, because you're supposed to be a strong Black woman, you're supposed to be strong, and people perceive that mental health is not a Black thing, so you can't really claim that you have mental health challenges, or that you need to support yourself mentally. And also a sense of community. So when you have a sense of community, then that is a support for mental health. Some of the factors influencing access to mental health services include income. So oftentimes you have to pay $200 to be able to access a mental health therapist. And some of the youths just don't have enough money to be able to pay that. Income, race, and lack of Black demographic representation. So one of the youths talked about, first of all, there's never any Black counselors. That's the biggest problem. How am I going to tell a white person that there's no food in the fridge and you're stressed, you're crumbling, and you can't do your work, and your teacher thinks you're a lazy piece of shit, and you're stupid, and you're not going anywhere in life because all you do is play basketball because that's your outlet? So again, income status, race, and the lack of representation out there interact to influence, access to mental health services, and also mental health of Black youths. And another talked about, like I'm experiencing racism. So this is telling a white person. They'd be like, what or what? Are you sure? Okay, let's get you some like other strategies you can deal with, like the workplace or something. So for example, someone that doesn't have experience dealing with issues related to race, not just feeling competent enough to be able to deal with issues that the youths were facing. And many of the youths talked about intergenerational relations. You may remember that I discussed that we did one conversation cafe related to intergenerational relations. The two most biggest things talked about by the youths, the top issue talked about the youths in terms of influencing their mental health was issues related to racism. The next one was intergenerational relations. So it involves, dealing with your parents, and sometimes it also involves dealing with parents who had experienced a lot of struggles while growing up, and who, were not as cognizant of the mental health needs of Black youths. So the same reason why they don't address mental health in Sudanese communities, because like the parents never got to address. They don't know mental health because they only know civil war. and running like you got to move on. So there were a few other issues that the youth talked about that I've not identified here, just due to limitations of time, including how religion influences mental health, and also how music helps in terms of mental health, and the stigma and the lack of knowledge and its contribution to mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Bukola, and thank you to all of our wonderful speakers today. As you may be already able to see, we've got a long list of questions in the Q&A already. There are two from Hussein Ahmed, who asks, are there reporting checklists in qualitative and quantitative mixed methods research, which include intersectionality, and what are the minimum standards or core features of including intersectionality in such research projects? So I thought these might be worth taking together, only because they seem already also to predict where we want to go with this series in terms of how we support or provide guidance to researchers who really want to work on intersectionality and how that method might be introduced. I don't know if either of you, Bukola or Denise in particular, have thoughts on this kind of checklist or the kinds of documents that might support or in response to these kinds of questions. Bukola.
I'm not sure. It's possible that Susan knows, but I am not aware that there's any checklist in terms of qualitative, quantitative methods to intersectionality. I know there are checklists related to qualitative methods. So I forgot the names of some of the few ones. Actually, there are a few ones out there in terms of qualitative methods and quantitative methods checklist, but intersectional, maybe that's the next thing we have to work on. Checklist, I'm not sure about that. I doubt it, but Susan may know more.
I mean, I always thought that we should, at Intersectionality of Genders, should develop a kind of diagram. I mean, this is not quite the checklist, but to kind of develop a diagram of how to actually get to an intersectional approach, right? And it would, I haven't had the time to really think that through, but to kind of make a decision tree of how you actually come to intersectional research design, because that for me would be the first step. I think there are some good resources on, and Denise might know more about that, on the the Funding Agency for Health Research, the Canadian
CHR website. Yeah,
I think they have some very good training materials. I don't know if they're checklists, but Denise, you probably would know this better than I do on that web.
Yeah, I think that CHR has been trying to develop, really and promote intersectional research and health research. And so I would go to their website for the Institute of Gender and Health and have a look at what's there, because there are also links to all kinds of resources, including, what does intersectional research look like when you're doing surveys and quantitative research and things like that, because I think that's a big question, how we can actually address those things when, again, as I said, we end up with these kind of static and additive approaches that can kind of freeze frame what are very dynamic intersections, but definitely worth checking that out.
The questioner who asked those questions also then followed up in the chat or in the Q&A with GBA plus or gender-based analysis plus, and I think that to build on what Denise has been saying, that sometimes, while those are very important starting points, I think, for analysis, sometimes they can have that additive effect, even though it's not, it's better to have that kind of analysis than not to have an analysis that brings any range of diversity into this. But the complexity with which intersectionality proceeds is a methodological problem. I mean, it's for this reason, in fact, that the questioner is asking about, that we're designing the series so that we can build the kind of supports that the community of researchers needs, and to kind of create a knowledge hub so that we can share that information and provide that kind of support to people who are developing projects from the ground up. So it's certainly a very valuable question. And the fact that those specific checklists don't exactly exist yet is also indicative of the emergent nature and the urgent nature of the questions for the field, I would say. I'm going to move on in the Q&A list here to a question from Michelle Hebert. Thank you for a well-designed series of presentations, informative and helpful. My first comment is addressed to Dr. Salami. I deeply appreciate you highlighting the value of weighing our words and how being involved brings different meanings than participating. And to all the presenters, many thanks for stimulating a shared vision for an equitable Canada and world. I don't think there's a question there, but I do want to make sure that we also kind of flag all of the appreciation that people are bringing in response to your remarks. Moving down through, we also have a comment from Flora LA. It's interesting the issue of mental health and the racial dimensions of getting healthcare, particularly the issue of relating with and addressing racial issues by mental health practitioners when access is possible. What would be the best way to address such intersectional gaps in mental health care? I think, Bukola, this might be one for you.
Well, I think, one of the, what are some of the best ways in terms of crossing some of these lines? I think it's the encounters that we have and continually having that encounter, but not just having the encounter, but also reflecting on such encounters. And I think, one of the things as a practitioner is being aware of your social locations, being aware of some of the, what you view, your perceptions of the world, will be very, very important in terms of being able to deliver some of those anti-racist practices. And then after you're aware, learning more to actually sort of correct, some of the ways that you may have, deficiencies in, in different things. So for example, as a Black person providing service to a Black person, you may have to do more reading than the average Black person to be able to really know how to be competent in some of the health services that you're delivering. And yeah, and I think, one of the things about intersectionality too is being aware of embedded power inequities too, that some of these interactions can create. And always realizing that, in a patient-provider relationship, that there's often issues related to power relations, all operated in diverse and multiple ways. And being aware of that and taking approaches in terms of bridging those lines of power.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think there's an ongoing conversation then about whether it's possible to approach that in checklist form. I see there was an exchange in the chat, and I think maybe what drives the question about the checklist is the question that I think also this person who is described as anonymous attendee poses in the Q&A. When they write, as an agency that provides services and support to women, how do we apply this learning to improve how facilitators approach their role? And this seems to be a related question, because I think what I hear in these questions is a wish for how can we be better? How can we do a better job of approaching the things that we do, the services we provide in the spirit of intersectionality? And I see Denise has put her hand up here. You want to weigh in, Denise, please?
Yeah, and just because I think not everybody saw the response that I gave to the question of checklists, and I think it goes back to the comment Dr. Lumen posed at the introduction about the potential of losing the potency of intersectionality as a social justice lens, one that focuses on power, and that, if we end up just with these checklists, and having been involved in starting out introducing even gender-based analysis to CIHR and seeing how that was all then reduced to a checklist, which was basically ignored for the most part. And I think that what we basically need are a set of questions for us to ponder when we are developing our projects and developing services. And I think that having those kind of reflective questions might in fact be more enriching than having a checklist that says, I've got, dealing with X, intersection X or intersection Y. Because again, as I mentioned, sometimes we're not sure of which parts of people are most salient. So as I mentioned before, when I've worked with HIV positive Indigenous women, it's indigeneity that is absolutely most salient for them. For a lot of the migrants I talk to, I mean, migration is most salient in a lot of, we're again in intersecting with gender and other factors. But I think we have to give space to that, and that is only done in conversation with the people we're working with. So it also goes back to what Dr. Salami said about, you know, really needing to be engaged with the communities and the groups in which we're working with. So.
Nothing about us without us, right?
Amen to that.
And, Susanna and then Bukola.
Yes, I mean, perhaps to kind of follow up or support or underline what Dr. Spitzer just said. I think it's the checklist is often what people do at the end. I think what we are actually, when we begin with reflective questions, we are really thinking about at the beginning of research design, what it actually, you know, which kind of intersections are salient, as Dr. Spitzer says, and how to shape that research based on this. And I think Dr. Bukola's Dr. Salami's example was really brilliant, because it was actually the youth who were determining which intersections mattered, right? I thought that was so fascinating about this research example from Dr. Salami, that she didn't set out with, oh, we're looking at the intersections of gender and sexuality or income, and you know, from what the way the research was laid out was actually that the participants decided and talked about which, and from that deductively the intersections became clear that actually mattered to the youth, which I thought was, you know, for me a really big learning from that presentation, right? So I think part of to the answer of how do we change research or services is training. And it's not something that can be done in a 2-hour workshop. I think this is really, how do we design services? What are the intersections that matter to the people that an organization serves? What intersection do they see as salient and important? And they might be different than what I, as a, you know, or somebody who organizes the service, begins with. And similarly for the research, you know, what intersections really matter to the project? And how do we get at that? Do the participants actually determine what matters, which might actually be surprising to researchers. But it's a beginning, you know, it needs to be, intersectionality is not something that gets introduced at the end when the grant proposal gets sent out, 2 hours before the grant proposal gets sent out. It's actually something, it's a lens or perspective that informs the project from the very beginning.
I just wanted to add to what Dr. Luhmann said in terms of, you know, one of the challenges, critiques out there about intersectionality is that what intersections? Right now, I and Dr. Early, we're doing a scoping review of the literature on how intersectionality, and Dr. Spitzer too, of how intersectionality has been used in terms of you know, diverse health research. And one of the things is, you know, one of those intersectionalities that we are thinking about is disability. But there's like 1,000 disabilities out there. so what intersectionality and how do you operate it? And I think, you know, Dr. Luhmann said it, you know, correctly in terms of, you know, from whose perspective are those intersectionalities chosen? So, you know, I would defer to what Dr. Spitzer said in terms of, you know, how is that conceived by the community, and now how do we engage the community in doing that? And, you know, going back to your question, just thinking through about, you know, the basic thing about intersectionality is no one is just white, no one is just Black, no one is just woman, or no one is just Muslim. We have seen, for example, in the case of Black Muslim women in Edmonton who are being attacked for no good reason, just, you know, for going on the, you know, for walking on the street. That, you know, it's not just the experience of being women. If not, other women would have been attacked. Or it's not just the experience of being Black, or the experiences of just being Muslim. It's the intersections of several of those that really, really predisposes them to attacks. So, you know, we need to go outside a cookie cutter approach and, you know, towards a much more social justice approach. So, you know, one of the things that I've thought about is in terms of, you know, when you're providing service, you know, you can't just provide the same blanket service for everyone. you need to consider, the unique locations. I was reading a grant proposal once, and and this is just talking about, if you're planning a grant or a proposal, and the proposal was for Black low-income women. And I think the program coordinator was going to get paid like maybe $50 per hour, I don't remember. But there was no 1 cent that is given to childcare, to transportation, that the women are going to get there. They need money to get there, low income, childcare, they're women, and and it's to take care of their mental health. I'm like, is this going to add to their mental health? Or address their mental health, especially given that we've not addressed to all the intersecting social locations that surround this woman's life. So I think it is thinking through some of our, and thinking through in terms of how can we be responsive to some of the service needs of people that are receiving service from us. Not in terms of using a blanket approach, but towards a social justice framework.
Well, and what I also hear in these responses is the need for us to consider there's no such thing as an abstract human, and that if we begin from that perspective in terms of health research and human subjects, then we expand out from not just there's a generic person at the heart of a research program or even a research team, but there are kind of a range of diverse needs to be calculated as part of a research program. And I think this maybe begins to speak to two questions that are emerging now in the Q&A. Where do people find the support, either for building better research teams or integrating intersectionality? And I think this series is our way also of trying to consult with the research community about what it is that people need in order to kind of build intersectionality into their programs. And so this is very helpful for us. And I noticed that we're starting to lose some people because it's close to the end of time, but it seems like a very good place for us to begin to think about what comes next. Our next session in this series is precisely about qualitative and quantitative research methods and about developing the kinds of resources and supports that our research community, our broader community need, and to kind of think about these as co-constituting. So I think we're here not just to deliver information to you about intersectionality, but to take in what it is that you need from us as a signature area, as a set of program coordinators, as a set of institutes that we serve you in the context of this university. And so how can we help to kind of build the kind of supports that you need? We have a question about the ways we can support this research. One thing might be for you to sign up for notifications from WICRI and from Intersections of Gender, and for you to send us information about your research that we can share in our newsletters and population surveys and that sort of thing. And so we want to make sure that we're partnering with you, I think, in other words. So this seems to be the first step in a conversation. And if you want to access this webinar afterward, please, the information is in the chat and also in the Q&A. I want to thank our wonderful panel of speakers here today. I don't want to keep anybody past the 2:30 time. And I hope you'll come back and join us, and please be in touch with us if there's something specific you'd like to see, or we can help you to develop some resources that were of use. There's no point in us doing research, as Bukola always says, just to sit on the shelf. So we want what we're doing and our programming to be useful to community members, to researchers, and we're here to partner with you to make all of our research better and always more intersectional. So thank you for your participation today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and have a great day, everybody.